listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. I am joined today by my friend, Rob Greenlee. Rob has been in the podcast industry for so long, probably one of the original podcasters. He is in the Podcast Hall of Fame. He is the founder of Spoken Life, and he also is working with StreamYard. He's working with No Mono. Really, Rob, you're just doing so much in the podcast space right now. I know you've got a lot of live shows and your own podcast.
Right.
So welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Heather. It's always great to be on your show. I think I've been on before in the past, and we've always had really interesting conversations about the podcasting medium, especially on the monetization side.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you and I met the other day and we started talking about YouTube. And after our conversation, I was like, I just have to have Rob on the show to talk about YouTube because I feel like it is complicated. And as many things in the podcast space can be sometimes complicated. And when I spoke to you, I felt like I really had a clearer vision of what was happening with YouTube in relation to podcasting. And so I really kind of want to unpack that because there's just so much around that particular topic. And YouTube really is having a dramatic impact on podcasting. Before we go down that path, though, can you tell me, in your opinion, what is the definition of a podcast?
You would ask that question. That's the question of the year, I think, and it's quite frankly, it's been a question of the medium really since day one. Let me start out by saying that when I started getting involved in podcasting back in 2004, when the name was given to podcasting, and this isn't very well known in the podcasting space, most of the podcasters that started this medium and were creating content did not like the name podcast. So let me just, and there's been various times in the past when there has been extensive discussion about podcasting is going to die, or it's going to, it's going to run its course. It's going to run out of steam. There's been lots of speculation about maybe we should have named this Netcast, or we should have named it something else, because people were fearful that that name was going to be attached to a consumption platform that would eventually go away, from a forward-looking perspective.
Mhm.
And if you really think about it, they were correct. The iPod, which was the foundation of the name of this medium, podcasting, um, went away. I think the last iPod got shut down just a year ago now, I think.
Sounds
Apple
right.
stopped making it. And one of the things that the early podcasters were concerned about was that that name would lose its relevancy and meaning to anyone because the iPod was going to disappear. And I think that others thought that there was probably a better name that could be given to this medium back in the early days. The problem is that nobody could come up with a better name. And that name had been mentioned in a Guardian article. Actually, I talked to the author of that Guardian article because he had written a book about RSS. I had him on my radio show, and like 3 weeks before he wrote the Guardian article, and just happened to casually in a list of like 3 alternative words, the word podcasting. And that became how this medium got named, was based on that article. Even though you speak to Dave Weiner or Adam Curry, they will dispute that. They will say that the name came from someone else and they had come up with it earlier and whatever. But the first really public mention was in the Guardian article um, that came out. This was in, I think it was late 2003 is when that article was written. So it was
Okay.
almost probably 6 months, 8 months before the medium really started, and people really started creating content and all this kind of stuff. Because what he was talking to me, that writer of the article was talking to me because he was a guest on my radio show, was how radio shows were increasingly making their shows available online as
Mhm.
an MP3 download, which I was doing. I was creating a link on my website to a download version of my radio show. And so that was before podcasting. It was even before I had an RSS feed with an enclosure. So that's kind of the real story behind that, and it's been out there. I think that real story is somewhat known, but I'm not sure that many people knew that in the early days of this medium, people did not like the name podcast. They were searching for other things to call it. Even Leo Laporte, which is he was a very early
Mhm.
podcaster. He actually, if you go back and look at his early network and his early shows, he used the term netcast for his show for many, many years. It's only been the last couple of years that he has changed his intros on his all of his shows to using the word podcast.
Oh,
For many years,
interesting.
he
I
used the
didn't know
word
that.
netcast. So that's a little bit of background story
Yeah.
to the whole name. So what podcasting means today, let's fast forward 20 years. And I think, the medium has changed because of the convenience factor of
Mhm.
consumption of this medium, and it's showing up in other types of platforms, the content, YouTube had a big presence starting in about 2007, 8, 9, but even prior to YouTube, video was a huge part of podcasting, in the early days of this medium. And that will come as a surprise to many.
Mhm.
There were entire media companies that were created back in, let's say, the 2007, 8, 9 timeframe that built their entire media brands around video podcasting. And
Hmm.
that is creating a video file and distributing it just like you would the MP3 file,
Mhm.
right? The same methodology. You attach an MP4 file to your RSS feed. And guess what? You submit it to Apple, and Apple still supports video podcasts today. So there were entire media companies, How Stuff Works was one of
Mhm.
them. Revision 3 was another one. All these companies sold to big media companies, How Stuff Works sold to iHeart, and Revision 3 was sold to Discovery Channel. So that was birthed out of video podcasting. And then when YouTube launched, a lot of content creators, because of the cost of hosting video, migrated their content over to, YouTube. They
Mhm.
stopped their video podcasting feeds. Even when I was working back at Microsoft, I built the Zune video podcast experience in Windows Media Center back when I was working for that company back in like 2010 timeframe. And so just to set this up, video podcasting was about 30, probably 30%, 40% of podcasting up until YouTube. And YouTube basically took all that content because it was free hosting
Mhm.
and they were building a community over there that people wanted to reach. And
Mhm.
so we saw all that content move over there. And then they started to develop their own content creators, right? That were
Right.
over there. And increasingly over the years, we've seen um, more and more people think about YouTube. And YouTube has kind of like thought about, well, there's people posting podcasts over here. So for many years, even back when I was working for Podcast One down in Los Angeles, this was back in 2014. I spoke to a small team at YouTube that was focused on trying to attract podcasters to
Mhm.
YouTube.
Mhm.
They didn't have any kind of formal, kind of external effort on that part. They just wanted the content. That's all
Mhm.
that they wanted on the platform. And so they had an initiative and they like to work with podcasters and because it was a great source of content for them. And so fast forward again, up to where we are today, we're seeing increasing research coming out saying that increasing numbers of people are seeing what appear to be podcasts in YouTube.
Mhm.
Increasingly, the listening or viewing audience is seeing those as podcasts and they're calling them podcasts or they're
Mhm.
perceiving them as podcasts. But there's not really a lot of shows on YouTube. I think it's increasing now that
Mhm.
are really an RSS-based distribution podcast that are on YouTube. I think there's a perception of it because if you're doing a show like we're doing here and it's available on YouTube, the viewer of YouTube might would just automatically think, well, that's what a podcast looks like. That's what it sounds like. So it must be a podcast. But the definition of podcast is being stretched based on that perception. And we're now facing a reality where the convenience and the availability of video in this medium is um, causing the industry to have to look at this again and say, well, is it time for us to expand our view on what a podcast is? Does it
Mhm.
make sense as an industry for us to view content that's available on YouTube or Rumble or Spotify video area as podcasts? I mean, look at Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan has a huge had a huge podcast. Many in the industry will say that Joe Rogan is no longer a podcaster because
Right.
guess what? He doesn't distribute his show off of RSS anymore.
Right.
Just true, he doesn't.
Right. It's just streaming on Spotify.
Right, but yet he shows up in all the ranking lists of
Right.
a podcast, right?
Yeah.
So, so this definition that we've had for many years that a podcast is only media distributed via an RSS feed is being broken apart now
Mhm.
and being expanded. And a lot of folks in the industry don't like that. A lot of folks in the industry don't want to accept that. But at the end of the day, my mind is maybe a little bit more flexible on this and how I think about the evolution of this medium and what I've seen over the years, right? I don't see a big difference between video podcasting and what's happening over on YouTube. I just
Mhm.
don't see a big difference there.
Mhm.
And I've been starting to embrace it myself personally. I started a show, um, called uh, Trust Factor. And it's basically a show that I'm doing this, what I call a converged strategy, which is basically creating a show for YouTube that's also made available as an audio podcast.
Mhm.
And I don't see where there's a huge problem with doing that. And I do see a large number of successful YouTube video creators that are taking their audio and increasingly putting them out as an audio podcast
Right.
in an RSS feed, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
That are finding success with that too. I know many of them myself, and um, some of them I watch on YouTube, and it's okay that I call them a podcast because they look, sound, and they're actually distributing on RSS as well.
Mhm.
So,
So they are.
I think right. So as we look at what's happening with YouTube, YouTube has now added a section where you can convert a playlist to the title of a podcast, and it will make that video series available in the YouTube Music experience, which is expanding its reach globally right now. And there's increasing talk that YouTube will embrace the ingestion or the submission of RSS feeds into their platform, which you've been able to submit your audio show into YouTube for many years through the podcast hosting platforms via the YouTube API that would automatically publish it over there for many, many years. So there's always been this tight integration
Mhm.
with
Mhm.
YouTube with podcasting, and I just think that it may be time for us to just accept the fact that, especially when YouTube is intending to ingest RSS feeds, that now they're going to be what's called a podcatcher, right?
Yes. Mhm.
Of sorts. So we will have to accept
Right.
this at some point if we don't yet already.
Right. Right. So you unpacked, just a lot there, and I
Good.
think I see podcast that the word podcast as becoming almost like Kleenex, right? Where,
Yeah.
and maybe that's not a great analogy since Kleenex is obviously a brand, but, it's taking this term and it's making it a very generic item,
Right.
right? And I that's kind of what I see happening in podcasts. So when you and I spoke the other day, I felt like I had such an aha moment around YouTube because part of the frustration that I've had in looking at YouTube is I'm not personally a YouTube watcher. Now,
Mm.
my 15 and 12-year-olds, I cannot get them off of YouTube, right? Like that is where they live and that is where they want to
Right.
stay. And they also do like to listen to podcasts. So they
Mhm.
listen to podcasts as well. But I don't personally spend a lot of time on YouTube. And, there's just been so much talk about YouTube. And I subscribe to YouTube Music thinking like, okay, I'm going to go to YouTube Music and then I'm going to find the podcast. I'm going to go onto YouTube and I'm going to
Yeah.
search for podcasts and I'm going to find something. And like, it just, for me, I felt like there was a real disconnect. As you mentioned, YouTube has ingested some RSS feeds. sampling the
I
idea of
think they're
ingesting them,
testing it right now,
right?
right?
Testing them, but the idea that they're going to eventually ingest RSS feeds. And for me, that's very clear, right? Like the minute that YouTube starts ingesting RSS feeds, they're just going to pull all the RSS feeds off of Spotify and Apple and every other place, right? That's what all, like you said, the podcatchers do. They ingest all these RSS feeds and then everything is available. And as you mentioned through your hosting platform, you have been able to, but you will easily be able to say like, here's my podcast, go and take it and, we're all good, right? I think for me, the aha moment was this podcast, the Podcast Advertising Playbook. When I go to YouTube Music, it wasn't there. And
Mhm,
you said to me, well, you need to create a YouTube playlist and title it podcast. And
mhm,
so I messaged my marketing person. I was like, hey, like, this is what we need to do. And so her and I met on Monday and she's like, "So I did that, but it was so easy. Like, did I miss a step? Like, what else do I have to do?"
right,
And we went on YouTube Music and it's like, "Nope, it's there." Right? So now if you go to
mhm.
YouTube Music and you search for the Podcast Advertising Playbook, it is there as a podcast. Whereas before, even though we were posting these on YouTube, it wasn't coming up that way. So for me, that was an interesting aha moment that really, like, this is how it's set up for the moment. Now, as you mentioned, it's probably not gonna stay this way, and I would presume that YouTube is gonna start ingesting RSS feed, but there's also been quite a bit of pushback, as far as I understand, on YouTube's side that they have said, essentially, like, the RSS feed is too primitive for us, like, we don't wanna take that in. We, like, rather just kinda play our own game. How do you see it?
Well, I think it's an interesting, conundrum for the industry because there's other factors at play here, and that's the desire in the industry to have what's called pass-through, which plays into kind of more related to metrics and monetization,
Right.
concerns, around the programmatic advertising, dynamic advertising. Um, and it's my understanding that there is some talk that YouTube is going to support pass through. So I don't know if that's decided in stone yet. I haven't heard confirmation on that, but there is some concern that because what has been expressed to me in the past when I've talked to the YouTube team is that they're video only and they will always host the media file.
Mhm.
That's clear because they have HLS streaming in their platform. They don't have this ability to play an MP3 file unless they intend on building that, which I haven't had any confirmation about that. So, but they might, right? If
Mhm.
they're going to have pass through, I don't see how that works with video if you're getting it from an audio file.
Mhm.
So, there's going to have to be some give and take here. And I know I expressed concern to them too that they need to think about the industry interest in pass through.
Mhm.
And but I also know that YouTube wants to monetize the content that's in their platform. So
Sure.
you have some natural tensions there that are developing around what the interests of the content provider is
Mhm.
and the interest of YouTube. And this is why, we've seen the direction that I believe that Spotify is heading down towards too, because I think it's difficult to talk about these issues without including Spotify, because
Mhm.
Spotify is heading towards a collision course with YouTube,
Mhm.
in their strategy
Mhm.
overall. You can kind of see it. It's been developing for a few years now. If you go back to the early days of Spotify, Spotify wanted to host all the media files themselves. And the only reason that they don't today is because the hosting platforms pushed back and said, no, we're not going to give you the content if you're going to rehost it. So we all signed contracts with them saying that we'll give you our content, but it has to be passed through.
And
Yeah,
Rob, just to make sure that we're defining what pass through means. So
right.
essentially what pass through is I'm a podcaster. I host my podcast on a hosting platform like Megaphone or Libsyn or Blueberry or
Sure.
Simplecast, right? So I'm hosting it. And right now, as ad sellers at True Native Media, I sell a BetterHelp ad and I insert that ad dynamically across the catalog of episodes for my podcaster
And it goes
and
everywhere.
and it goes everywhere, right? It doesn't matter if somebody listens to the podcast on Spotify or Apple or Overcast or on their website, right? Like they
Right.
can be anywhere, they can listen anywhere, and they're going to hear that BetterHelp ad. And so with pass through, what we're talking about is we're saying if YouTube is going to ingest these RSS feeds, then can that RSS feed be hosted on your hosting platform? And when I insert my BetterHelp ad, am I going to hear it if I listen through YouTube? And so, of course, YouTube is saying, hey, I want a piece of the pie, right? Because that's how YouTube has played.
Right.
And obviously, we can see they've got their own dynamic insertion technology, right? When you watch YouTube, there's ads all over the place. So there's that piece. I've also heard, talks about even embedded ad reads, right? There are rules that YouTube has in place for content creators about how many ads they can put into a YouTube video that is just an embedded, native ad read within their content. So when we talk about pass through, that's the important piece. And as an industry, we want that pass through because we want to support the infrastructure that has been created.
Right. And it also, if it's not embraced, and let's say that platform like a YouTube captures a single version of a MP3 file, right? And
Mhm,
then duplicates it over on their platform because they want to stream it. Then guess what? Any ads that were included in that media file are permanent. They cannot be updated. They will be always in that program unless there's some AI algorithm that goes through and looks for that and strips it out of the media file
mhm,
before it's rehosted. So
mhm,
there is methodologies out there that would enable a YouTube type platform or a Spotify type platform to remove the ads. I know that technology exists in Libsyn today
mhm.
to replace you know,
'Kay.
basically replace the ads that are included in an MP3 file with
Mhm,
new ads.
mhm,
So that technology exists and it's being used on some platforms. It's not a common tool, but it does exist and it's possible. And that could be one solution here. So and that's the real danger is that if we're not smart about this, that synchronization of that media file into another platform that wants to rehost that content will forever have old ads in it, and
mhm.
I don't think that's good for anyone.
Mm-mm.
Uh, that's not good for YouTube, and it's not good for the content creator
Yeah, for
type of
sure.
scenario. Right.
So I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with one of our agency partners that is heavily buying in podcasts and also heavily buying in YouTube.
Mhm.
And it was just a very timely conversation because I knew you and I would be talking, but also very interesting to look at the way that they approach buying in these two kind of distinctly different platforms and ways. So it's been fascinating to me in the last couple of weeks. We have gotten a couple of inquiries at True Native where podcasters approach us and say, "Hey, can you sell ads on our podcast?" And it's all on YouTube. They're not on any of the hosting platforms anywhere, right? They
Right.
just have a YouTube channel because they are sitting here like you and I are, and they have podcasting mics. They are calling it a podcast, but it
Mhm.
has no audio component. So I asked this agency buyer, I said, how do you define that? Right. So, are you defining that as a podcast when you're doing your ad buying? Is that how you're seeing it? And what she communicated to me, which I thought was just really fascinating, is that they really do look at them as being different things because there's also the simulcast, right? So when we look at the podcast advertising playbook, you can get this, on Spotify and Apple and all the players, right? Because we're being distributed through an RSS feed. We also, as I mentioned, have our YouTube channel. We put the podcast up on the YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Now, thanks to you, you can go to our YouTube music and listen to the podcast and see the video through that outlet. So, if we were going to this particular agency and saying, "Hey, we want to, sell you this show," what they would look at is they would essentially aggregate that audience. So they would say, "Let's look at the audience that you have on your, RSS feed, and we're going to look at those numbers. And then let's look at your YouTube audience, and that's your total podcast audience." However,
Mhm.
If somebody just has a YouTube channel and they don't have an audio component to it at all, they view that as a YouTube channel and they're going to buy it as a YouTube channel. They're not going to buy it as a podcast. And for me, I feel like ultimately we do have to look at the buyers in this space, right? Like
Mhm.
how are the ads being purchased and that is an important reflection on what it is that we should be selling. And so
Yeah.
there is that distinction between a YouTube content creator and a podcaster, at least in the minds of this one particular agency. But I think as we
Yeah.
kind of, unpack this and peel back the layers of this onion, there's a lot of complexity to it.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk next about that topic is around metrics,
Mhm,
and how that plays into that buyer's choices. I would say that the metrics around counting, plays or experiences on YouTube is different than counting plays and experiences on podcasts. So I think it does make sense for a buyer to think differently about the
mhm,
two mediums and try and have a better understanding. There's also some advantages to the buyer around buying a YouTube experience because there is deeper metrics there.
mhm.
But if you're just looking at the raw kind of like play data, right? It may not be at the same comparable level as to like the IAB podcast metric standard. There may be a discrepancy there between the two
Mhm,
around how they're counted,
mhm.
which somehow, there has to be some discounting or some equalization in the buy because let's say you're taking the podcast metrics from an audio distribution, and then you're just adding the YouTube numbers. Let's say just the raw views. Those raw views may not be counted in the same way. So you may have a skewed outcome there. But you can, if you look in your dashboard on YouTube, you can see how far people on average listen to your or view your content,
Mhm, mhm.
right? So you have a level of information that may be a little deeper than generally you can get from a broad
Sure.
distribution strategy
Right,
on podcasts too.
right.
So there's advantages and disadvantages on both sides.
But I think you really bring up such a good point, and in my early days of selling podcasting, one of the things that I would say, which I still really stand behind, I don't think that YouTube Shorts has helped this at all.
Mhm.
When people consume podcasts, on average, they listen to 80% of the podcast. And then if you say, okay, well, on average, most podcasts are 40 minutes long, then we're saying, hey, somebody's listening to somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes of your content. That's in podcasting. Now, if you
Right.
stack that up to YouTube,
It's
YouTube
not
doesn't hold
anywhere
a
close.
candle, right? It's
Right,
like 2 minutes or a minute. I
right,
should have looked that number up before we recorded this episode, but it's a very, very short period of time.
right. I think it is less than 2 minutes, right, is the average
Yeah.
if you look
So
at
it's
right.
it's like, okay, from an advertiser perspective, I think we have to look at the quality of the audience. And for me, the value in podcasts has always been intentionality.
Mhm,
You do not stumble on a podcast. You are there because you want to be there and you are
right,
listening to it with all of your intention.
mhm.
I can promise you from watching my children consume YouTube, there is 0 intentionality. I shouldn't say
Yeah,
0. Of course, they have their channels that they like,
mhm,
but they also watch shorts a ton, and
mhm,
they just get served so much, and
yeah,
that viewer of that video is a different quality of audience member, especially when we're talking about host-read endorsements, because if you listen to this show and you like me and I tell you that I just made my first hungry root meal a couple weeks ago and it was super easy and super tasty, you care because you know who I am. If I've
right,
never seen you before and you just happen to show up in my YouTube feed and you say hungry root is great, I'm going to say, "Oh, okay, hungry root." But it isn't going to have the same kind of impact if somebody
right.
that you know, like, and trust recommends a product. So I do, just from a very fundamental level, see them as being different audiences. Now, as you said, YouTube has a lot of metrics that we don't have in podcasting.
Right.
YouTube also has a massive audience that we still don't have in podcasts and probably will never have in podcasts.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
there's so much give and take in it, but I do still see them as being distinctly different,
There.
especially from a consumption perspective.
And I think you raise a really good point, Heather. And this is the message that I've tried to communicate about this debate as well, is it's okay for us to view this as a podcast, but I think as we communicate it to the podcasting, so there's different audiences involved here. There's the podcaster, there's the viewer of the content or the listener, and then there's the technical infrastructure of the distribution of
Mhm.
podcasting. And I think when we talk about these topics, I think we have to be specific on who we're talking to.
Right.
So, because I'm concerned about people getting confused and having really kind of a misunderstanding. So when we talk about podcasting, including YouTube, um, YouTube is kind of clouding the waters a little bit by naming what they're doing a podcast. Their strategy you have to take into account is to capture more content, right? They're trying to get content creators to publish over to YouTube and to think of them as a podcast distribution platform for their own interests, right? They're growing their advertising revenue base. They're based on viewing time and how many people watch and all this stuff. Their metrics is driving their choices, and they're kind of, they're kind of scraping the podcasting industry to get more content into their platform. And that's that's what every platform does. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what Apple did, that's what
Yeah. Good on
Spotify
them.
does.
That's business. Like, yeah,
Right.
that's what they
That's
should
what
be
they
doing.
that's what they do. But that's so when we talk to various constituents in this ecosystem, right? I think it's okay, like you just said, to say, well, the ad buyers think of what's in YouTube as not a podcast. So when they buy podcasting, they're buying a very specific kind of a metrics that's coming out of that is unique to that medium. And I think each one of these things is a different medium. And
Mhm.
I
Yes.
think we're safe to say that. And then there's different constituencies that are related to that. So when we talk about it, and I try and, like I mentioned earlier, I try and talk about it specific to who I'm talking about, but oftentimes people want to simplify these discussions and say, well, podcasting is now part of YouTube and we just have to accept that. Okay. And that's a blanket conversation that applies to everyone. I don't think it does. So I don't think it should, but that's not an intellectual way of looking at the market, right? It's
Mhm.
not a advanced way of helping others understand what's going on here because it's a complex. The distribution issues in podcasting have only gotten more complex, and a couple of topics that we talked about before we started recording um, kind of expands on that. I think things are going to become even more complicated as we look to the future, but it doesn't take us down a path where we don't want to take advantage of opportunities that are out there to grow this medium
Right.
into something bigger. But the only way to do that rationally is to be clear with people on what pieces of this pie exist and not thinking of it as one thing,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because then that's going to take people down making bad choices.
Right. I totally agree with you because
Right.
as we just said, they are different. They are different elements. They're different mediums and you
Yep.
you have to look at them differently. Now, of course, if YouTube decides to ingest RSS feed and people listen to a podcast choosing to listen through YouTube instead of through Apple and instead of through Spotify, which I have seen lots of reports saying that
Go
YouTube
ahead.
is where most people listen to podcasts more than any other. So, I
Yeah,
mean,
but is
if
that a perception or is that a reality is the question. It depends on how you define what a podcast is, right? Whether or
right, it
not
goes back
that's
to that
true.
exactly, that beginning
Right.
question I had for you is what is a podcast, right? But I do see the point that if YouTube is going to actually really be providing real podcasts, then I don't then there will be that distinction between a YouTube podcast and a YouTube content creator, right? Because of the way that people consume the mediums, and that's why they're different for me. So, Rob, I know you and I could go on and on, but this has been a terrific conversation, probably just a
Yeah.
teaser for what is actually to come. And I'm sure there will be more conversations to be had. But thank you so much for coming on the
Yeah.
show. And I just really appreciate your knowledge and all your dedication and everything that you've done for the industry. So, thank you
Well,
for
thank
being
you.
here today.
Thank you, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to kind of clarify on these topics because I think a lot of people are confused about what's happening and thinking that things are happening that may not be exactly the way they're being perceived today.
Yeah, for sure. If people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
I can be found on X at Rob Greenlee. I have my own website, robgreenlee.com. You can reach me on email as you want. If you would like to, rob.greenlee@gmail.com is a great place to reach me. And just do a search for me if you want to find some of the shows that I'm doing on YouTube as well as in podcasting. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Rob. Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode as much as I have. Not joking when I say I probably could talk about this for a few hours. Meet me at the next podcast conference and we will. But thanks for listening, and we will catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.